I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Levoy, Hurley.
Chris Cole.
Bill Beard.
John Cote.
Brian.
Bickel.
Barbara Tellman.
Brad Nelson.
Brian Bickel by phone.
Pickles in the pickle.
Okay, call to the public. We have a visitor here. Do you wish to say anything?
No, I hope to serve on the commission that I'm appointed tomorrow.
Oh, are you the green?
Richard Fridena, yeah, I'm
Okay.
the green part.
Great, okay. Why don't you just come up and sit here and not vote or anything, but
Oh.
be part of the group?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay,
Well, that means
Chairman.
we can't elect him chair yet. They postpone the elections.
Okay, Chairman's report. Brian, do you have anything to say?
Nothing of terrible significance. There's and I don't have Bill's list of legislative activity in front of me, but there are a couple of items on there that I think are significant to the cause of the organization. The first one being HB 2021 that Representative Pinchon has introduced, provides electronic signature gathering capability on statewide initiatives, which, barring something that we haven't been able to figure out in the piece of legislation, I think is a good idea. The other one is HCR 2002, which was introduced by Representative Fillmore. Has to do with changes in the Independent Redistricting Commission, something that personally I certainly don't support the activities in his proposed legislation, but something that I think certainly merits following as far as the commission is concerned. Other than that, I did ask Michael to distribute copies of the annual report. If you have recommendations or changes, I'd appreciate it if you'd email them to me. I'll make those changes and redistribute hopefully for final approval at the February meeting, but that's all I have at this time.
Okay. 5, election of chair and vice chair.
We can't do it. It requires 2/3.
Oh, okay.
We're short on that.
Is it 2/3 of the total or 2/3 of those present?
Yeah.
We got 6, 2/3.
I
think
It
six.
states right here, 2/3 of the eligible commissioners of the EIC who are appointed and qualified must be present to hold election of office.
He's
So
not-
actually, yes, we do. We just have 2/3.
Yeah.
But
1,
it's-
2,
not-
3, 4, 5, 6.
Correct.
Does-
I would assume so, because
Yeah.
it's asking. So,
Okay, so we can have an election.
Yes.
And I'd like to nominate Brian for chair.
Second?
Any other nominations?
Are we just doing chair?
And vice chair.
Oh, and vice chair.
No other nominations? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Brian, speak up.
Brian? You are chair again. Okay, vice chair.
Okay,
Any nominations for vice chair?
I'll nominate you.
Any seconds?
Second.
Any other nominations? No? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, both the chair and the vice chair, Brian Bickel and Barbara Tellman, were elected unanimously.
Why don't you say something and vote no, just to do it?
What party are you again?
Okay, Bill Beard, prospective legislative changes.
I do apologize for not having it distributed, but as is usual at the beginning of the session, there's a whole bunch of stuff that occurs in that first week, and this year was no exception. As of this time yesterday, there was about a page and maybe 1 or 2 on the second page, but as of late last night, there was we went to 4 pages of prospective legislation. It appears that for right now, a lot of the election-related bills in the legislature are on the House side. Not a real surprise. I do not believe that the Senate has an actual formal elections committee this session. I know there was some talk about Michelle Ugenti-Rita being the chair of that, but for whatever reason, the Senate decided not to do that. I have had some conversations with her. I've had some conversations with the folks over on the House side, Representative Townsend, Representative Carroll, and a few others, about legislation in general. They're not trying to paint with any partisan brush here. Let's just say the stuff that went on in Maricopa County this last season has got a lot of folks in the legislature from Maricopa County rather incensed and proposing legislation right and left for both the recorder side and the elections department side. We'll see what comes of that.
Are any of those bills relating to the use of vote centers?
Yes.
Some of them are, but the ones I've seen, and Brad, you probably might know a little bit more about these, because I haven't had the conversation with the specific sponsors yet. I haven't seen anything dramatically different, but it's more just technical things and clarifying language. From the conversations I've had with people up there, and this is not uniform, there is some interest in doing some heavier lifting, if you will, in terms of changing some things, both on the procedures manual side, clarifying when those things are supposed to be produced, things like clarifying what is an emergency voting center, how many there's supposed to be, the geographic distribution, those kind of things. There is some interest in that. I don't know, I haven't seen any language yet, so I have no idea whether those will actually take place this session or not. As Brian mentioned, there's a couple that are out there that probably would reorient the election law landscape in the state of Arizona. One I'm a little interested in, only because I've had the conversation with her, is HB 2489, Election Procedures Oversight Committee. I know the members that have been on this commission for a while have heard language and conversation out of the Secretary of State's office, both with Michelle Reagan and I believe even with Ken Bennett, that the idea of the Pima County Election Integrity Commission, there is some interest in doing something on a statewide basis along the lines of what we do here, if for no other reason to help educate, especially the legislators, on what some of these problems are that are being encountered. In my experience, talking to legislators of both sides of the aisle, frankly, they don't spend enough time diving deep into how all of these different laws interact with one another, how the procedures manual interacts with the law, how, versus the Constitution, those separation of powers, all those things. So when they're proposing legislation, oftentimes it's either cosmetic or it may cause more problems than it's trying to solve. So
They don't think it through completely.
and part of that is the very nature of the way election law works in this state. You've got that separation of powers, you've got this system that's supposed to, the recorder checks, the elections department checks, the Secretary of State, et cetera, et cetera. It's not something where you can just write one line of legislation and expect the world to be dramatically changed. So having a commission at the statewide level, I would be interested to see if there's some interest in both houses of the legislature to see if something happens there.
And who would this commission report to?
Right now, as I understand it, goes to the Secretary of State. It would be along the lines of what I suggested for the Bi-Partisan Commission to look at election laws in general, and we'll get to that in the next issue. But it would be similar that you'd have people from the legislature that could appoint members, folks from the governor's office, et cetera. They get together and they issue an annual report basically on the conduct of that year's elections. Were there problems? What were the problems? How did they get resolved? Is it something that needs a legislative change? Is it something that needs a procedures manual change? Whatever it happens to be. You toss on top of that whatever is going on at the federal level with election laws in general, be it something Congress passes or there's a lawsuit about something. It just further makes all these interlocking pieces even more fun to peel apart. Again, as I said at the beginning, there isn't anything that dramatically changes the landscape, at least that I've seen so far. But in conversations I've had with some people, there is some things in the offing, I just haven't seen language yet myself personally, so.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you have any, the answer?
Again, taking strictly, many, as Bill has related to, pertains more to the early voting process than it does to, if you will, election day process. But some of those things that or would potentially impact early voting will, if it comes to be law, impact polling place voting. And again, I'll be a subjective, just read what it's all about rather than to say whether I like it or dislike it. But Senate Bill 1032 by Gentilita is suggesting that when you go in to do walk-in early voting prior to election day, one is required to show the identification that one would have to show as one would present oneself on election day at a polling place. I'm not certain how that's going to be fleshed out going forward either. Presumably, you have the opportunity to go and get the necessary ID and come back later on, or vote a provisional ballot. I've never heard of a provisional early ballot before, but again, those are some of the things that need to be worked out. Senate Bill 1046, again from the same senator, suggests that if you're on the permanent early voting list and you don't turn in your permanent early vote via the mail, you cannot turn it in on election day. That is going to lead to potentially additional provisional ballots as well. As we talked about, I think in this meeting, I was able to watch the video from this meeting and past meetings as well. The ability for the curing of signatures is Senate Bill 1054. And I think that's kind of where my interest lays. There is a bill, HB 2050, that's attempting to move the primary election to a date in May, but if you actually do the math and count back the number of days from the general election, it ends up being in July. The bill sponsor is aware of that. They're not quite sure how to cure right now.
I will say, based on previous years of legislation, there seems to be more interest this year amongst legislators to change the primary date than there has been in the past. I'm not saying it's enough to make an actual change, but there is a little more interest than I've heard in past sessions.
That's all.
Good.
Can someone enlighten me as to why we picked the date we have now for the
Ask the legislator.
no, I mean, some of you must know the background, because I do not.
Well, it has changed through the years. It actually used to be, let me rephrase this. Rather than saying it's a particular date in a particular month, you take the general election and then count back a number of days from that particular day and time. That's the way the law has read forever and ever. But that number of days to count back from the general election has changed through the years. Historically, we've had our primary election after Labor Day. That leaves very little time to conclude the election, do any necessary recounts, and do any necessary contest, and find out what a contest might come to mean, and be able to get the ballots printed in time for that succeeding general election. So that's been the motivating factor that's moved it back. Right now, it's, I forget what the X number of days are, but we're in late August right now.
I think it's 90 days.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I think is hurting the most. Whenever you have a primary election race that's very close and keeps you from printing ballots in time, that gets people's attentions real quick. Right now, all jurisdictions in the state of Arizona, and indeed I think across the nation, have to get their ballots out to their overseas voters 45 days in advance of the election. That is just too short a time, and I think that's what's motivating part of the discussion.
So what is the preponderance of thought on this from other states? This can't be, we can't be inventing the wheel here.
Most states have their primaries earlier than we do. Some have them later, but others have them, or many have them earlier. Usually in June is.
One of the prime motivations for the legislature to keep the primary date as late in the summer as possible is the prohibition in the legislature when they are in session from collecting any donations for their campaign elections. That, more than anything, has prevented primary election date being moved earlier in the year, probably than any other thing.
And how do other states handle that? Do they do? And of course, if the guys went home like they're supposed to, as opposed to extending their sessions, that might not be a problem.
As Bill alluded, many times when you change something in elections here, you're gonna change something else here. Certainly if we move the primary the primary election date back, that changed filing deadlines, that changes when perhaps the signature basis for getting signatures is going to change. So I think there's a lot of things that still need to be worked out, and I think that's partially why we're doing it in incremental change rather than broad cloth changes.
Does it strike anyone else as it strikes me that August is a horrible time? It's a horrible time for anyone to be soliciting votes, walking around, participating in this kind of thing. People are out of town, people are away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, it's like summer, John, you know, you move it to June or July, and it's we're in Arizona. What do you want?
Also,
Well,
the earlier
I
the
came from Florida, so I understand the summer situation.
Also, the earlier the primary, you could argue the more relevant the primary is, especially during the presidential election, which is why we have the PPE so early in the year, so that people are willing to pay attention to us.
Right.
Without that, they're not going to pay attention to us because our primary is basically when all of the conventions are done and over with. Or at least, you know, practically. So,
So from your perspective, having said that, what do you think?
personal opinion,
Yeah.
not libertarian opinion, because I don't know what the libertarian stance is on this. I think the Arizona primary should be late spring.
Strikes me that that's the way it is in most states. Is that not right? Does anybody have any feel for that, any statistics at all?
Arizona is, for a very long time, has been one of the last states to have a primary. I mean, I think the only ones right now, there's like 5 or 6 that have primaries. After Labor Day, I think New York is one of them. Part of the problem too is that our primary date, with the advent of the early voting process, essentially the general election is 6 weeks after the primary date. For practical purposes, it's a 6-week general election. And taking off my partisan hat and just looking at it from an election integrity standpoint, that's stupid.
Yeah.
Is there any, you mentioned one of the problems is collecting donations during the session. Is there any talk of changing that?
Every person I've talked to where this subject has come up, it's basically been, they're of two minds. One, they want to move the primary date for a whole host of reasons, and I've even heard a couple people actually say they'd be interested in looking at the primary date and the PPE being combined, which would really change things. Anyway, the other ones are the ones that they just don't want to talk about it because of the prohibition on raising funds during the session. And I haven't heard any conversation yet about, well, could you change that provision or modify it somehow? I haven't heard anything along those lines, and frankly, I don't know how you modify that prohibition and keep the campaign finance folks from raising holy hell and filing lawsuits like
How do other states handle it, Bill?
Other states, I haven't looked at other states enough to know for sure, just casual reading here and there. In cases where legislators are in session 12 months out of the year, it's, you know, they just have stricter provisions about, you know, you can't do it on state grounds and, you know, whatever else. But, you know, in those cases, they do like they do at the Fed, in Congress in D.C. You have your Capitol Club for the Dems, you have your Capitol Club for the Republicans, and that's where you go raise your funds. It's right next door to the Capitol. I mean, it's not, you know, this stuff is not hard when you think about it, but asking members of the legislature to think beyond 1 or 2 steps is sometimes difficult.
You can't collect your clean elections money during the session.
True.
Well, is this something that we want to understand better and have a position or a recommendation on? Or do we just want to let this
it's not so much that. We are responsible to the Pima County Board of Supervisors. We're not responsible to the state legislature. We can suggest to the Board of Supervisors that they raise an issue with the governor, secretary of state, legislature.
Yeah, that's where I'm headed.
But really, our primary focus and concern is and should be the elections in Pima County. Now, if somebody comes up with a Arizona Election Integrity Commission, then that would be their responsibility, and I'm not trying to slough this off, but we don't want to fill our plate so full that we can't do our primary job.
Well, I understand that part of it. Let me ask you what our primary job is during these off-season times like right now. We've had a great election in terms of it being reasonably clean, in terms of our Pima County goes. There's some arguments about mail-in ballots and some of the other things, but
You know, this is part of the routine stuff that we do in the off-season. You know, looking at the election laws and how the changes would affect Pima County. Also work with the county recorder and the county elections department and anybody else relevant to try and see problems and prevent them. You know, it's not all that great if you're so busy bailing out the lifeboat that you can't fix the hole in the bottom.
And part of the purpose of Bill giving us this report is our personal information too. As commissioners, we should be well informed about what's going on.
well, are we to be proactive about some of this, or are we supposed to be, and make suggestions to the board, to the, they need to be thinking about it? Are we is it part of our role to be the think tank about these kinds of issues for our respective constituency, so to speak, which is the board?
The way the board has
Madam
operated.
Chair,
Brian, did you have something to say?
a couple of things. Going back to the original subject of movement of the primary date, looking at it from a candidate's perspective, one of the things that moving the primary earlier into the year does is it makes the general election more meaningful, particularly
Yes.
if you've got a primary where you have multiple candidates in the party out of power, for lack of a better term, running against an incumbent. You essentially have a general election campaign for the incumbent that lasts as long as it lasts, and a 10-week campaign. And 10 weeks is the official term for the primary to be ahead of the general election. But you then have a 10-week campaign where the primary winner of the party out of power gets to run against the incumbent. So from a candidate's perspective, yeah, the earlier the primary election, the better. As far as our role in what's going on, I think, I don't know that I would call us a think tank, but the ability to sit around and discuss issues relevant to the electoral process. And I know Barbara, you, and to a large extent Benny White when he was on the commission, not necessarily as a commissioner or a representative of the commission, took a lot of the information that was garnered during the meetings and lobbied either the Secretary of State or various legislators to fix some of the problems. I find that to be very beneficial. And then discussing the information that you present or those conversations, when we get down to something that's actually relevant to making either a recommendation or providing us as individuals, again, not as commissioners, from taking a position on election law there's a lot of valuable information that gets discussed during the course of the meeting. So I think it's beneficial, whether it's relevant to what we're supposed to do or not, is enjoy the dialogue, and I've always found it an opportunity to learn something that I didn't know or understand before.
The other question about the role of this commission in the off period is that the procedures manual will at some point start to be drafted. And while we may not as a commission comment on the manual, we definitely can as individuals.
I do think based on, this, I'm starting my 6th year on this commission, based on the history of both the actions of the commission and what members have, I've spoken with members, they've spoken with me, both in and out of the meeting. One of the things this commission does have the ability to do, when there is something that, by and large, there's some consensus amongst the members of the commission, and in cases where it's unanimous, if there is something we truly believe that there is some legislative changes, procedures manual changes that need to be made, I think it's fully within our responsibility and our duty as members of this commission to recommend to the Board of Supervisors. This is important enough, you, the Pima County Board of Supervisors, need to weigh in on this particular issue at the legislature and say you are for or against, as the case may be, this particular piece of legislation, because from an election integrity standpoint, this is, going to advance the ball, or it's going to, put it, further back, period.
Very good.
So.
In the past, we have had the experience that the Board of Supervisors early on in the session or before the session instructs their lobbyists as to what are their priorities across the board, and election integrity might be one of the priorities. We have not been in the past consulted on that, or we were once consulted after the fact. But we might.
We got a copy of Chuck's memo.
We might get with pro.
But I also think we have in the past beat the Board of Supervisors and made a recommendation to them.
We made recommendations.
Yeah, before they instructed the lobbyist.
Sometimes they listen to us, sometimes they don't.
Okay, are there any further
Well,
discussion here?
let me just follow up on this, so, for just a second here, because we talked about some things that sound important. I think they sound important to you. So, is it our thought that we ought to be saying to the board, hey, consider moving the date forward, or backwards rather, on into the spring, prior to Labor Day, because it makes a better election? Makes the results.
What we would be able to do, properly able to do, is recommend to the board that they push the legislature. Because it
They
makes,
direct the lobbyists to
yeah,
support moving the primary.
because that makes for a better election here in Pima County.
Okay. So is that something that this group wants to talk about further today, or have an action on?
Today, we can't, because of the open meeting law, it has to be on the agenda.
And I think once we have an idea of what actual bills have been introduced with specific dates, I think we'll be in a better position rather than just to say it ought to be earlier. Because there are a lot of reasons why it can't be a certain amount earlier.
If I may, I would also suggest that this commission might want to get some input from the recorder.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I said it may be pertinent to get some information, or some input rather, from the recorder going forward as well. Because they're the ones that are mainly up against that date to get those early ballots out.
Is there a organization, like a professional organization, to which you guys belong, as the elections department, that keeps track of where this is going
Oh, yeah.
in the United States?
We could care less about what's happening in the United States.
Well, but
That's pretty obvious.
you know, there are, like, there's engineering standards or whatever, or there's these manuals. These manuals didn't get written from scratch.
Actually, they did. The
Okay.
procedures manual was actually the child of a former state elections director, a former secretary of state, a former county elections director here in Pima County, and a former county elections director in Maricopa County. That's not 5 different people, that's one person. And basically, he saw, his name is Jim Shumway, if those of you who may have a history of elections here. He basically saw pandemonium going on, 15 different counties looking at the same statute and coming up with 15 different interpretations on how to do it. and he decided that, yes, the statute says you need to do this, but a procedure manual says this is how you do this. And so the procedures manual actually did start from a scratch piece of paper. It has been amended going forward. Now, you asked another question about organizations. Here within the state of Arizona, there is the Arizona Association of County Governments. They are, for lack of a better term, a lobbying group. Within that organization, there are sheriff's organizations, county supervisor associations, recorders associations, and election officials associations, who either comment on proposed legislation or draft legislation themselves going forward. So so the focus is on Arizona. Certainly, I said that we don't care what happens elsewhere in the United States. I would say most other places in the United States are actually copying what's happening in the western United States. As you look eastward towards North Carolina and Georgia and things of that nature, they are actually scratching their heads and figuring out what happens better elsewhere. And in the western United States, it seems to be going along better than in the eastern United States. That's my
We still
opinion,
have
not to be construed. Oh, absolutely. There are no perfect elections, and there never will be. But there are organizations that apply to the legislature for the introduction of bills or to comment on existing bills. There's the ability for election officials to have influence over federal election law as well. But by and large, federal election law is pretty non-existent because they leave it up to the 50 individual states to do what they will. If you will, those laboratories of democracy out there that try and get the thing right rather than having one national
Laboratories or
standard.
laboratories?
Laboratories.
Depends.
I think we're getting a little away from
Yeah.
the agenda item here.
I did want to say one thing though, tying back to why we track this and why it's important. Part of the problem, since we only meet once a month, and the legislature basically is 120 days, maybe 150 days, depending upon the year. Because of our schedule meeting once a month, the Board of Supervisors, their meeting schedule and their notification schedule, oftentimes trying to push something on a specific piece of legislation can be difficult because of the overlapping schedules, and trying to get the Board of Supervisors to do something for a specific piece of legislation. I'm not saying it can't be done, but as a commission, it probably needs to be something that we really have some heart and soul in. Otherwise, it's probably based on past experience, individually going to members of the legislature and pushing it that way, simply because of the logistics of trying to put all these things together.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Brian?
as a suggestion to address some of the issues that Commissioner Cote brought up, if Bill could get the most current list he has available of pending legislation out to the commissioners, that gives us as much time to review it prior to next month's meeting as possible. And any items that we find on there that are particularly moving or we feel passionate about as an individual can be discussed at next month's meeting. And if we have some items that we can develop consensus on, I certainly don't have any problem drafting a memo to the Board of Supervisors that addresses those particular issues, asking them, or not asking them, telling them, and not telling them in the form of a directive, but telling them this is our position on a particular bill. And we recommend that their direction to the county lobbyist is to support or not support particular pieces of legislation.
Brian, I just remind you that I tried diligently, and as I explained to Michael before the meeting, the problem is that sometimes the bills that are the most pertinent to the conversation of this commission sometimes don't get dropped in a timely manner.
Or get changed.
I'm being polite.
And I understand that, it's just, we'll play the cards we're dealt initially.
All right.
And of course, anybody can go onto the legislature's website and get the information about the bills that's where Bill got.
Last page has the link.
So anybody can do this individually at any time. But it's really helpful to have Bill summarize it all.
I will send out, did you send it to
Yeah,
everybody?
and you got it, I sent it to you this morning about 8:15.
Okay, so if the rest of you didn't get it, I will make sure that you have this information.
Move on to the next item. Bill Beard again, proposal to form a bipartisan commission. I'd like to tell you, Bill, that I did submit it to the Secretary of
That was
State.
one of my questions.
And there are other priorities right now.
I understand.
It's a good idea, but let's wait a minute. Okay,
I
so-
understand. I think everybody knows to one degree or another that I have forwarded this, and Barbara was kind enough to forward it to the new Secretary of State. The reason I put it before this commission to consider is I truly think it would be helpful if the Board of Supervisors put some weight behind the idea. The longer I've dealt with election law, procedures manual, the pros and cons of changing various pieces of legislation, etc., the conversations I've had with the various members of this commission, even members of the legislature on both sides, to be blunt, the members of the legislature, 90+% of them, don't have the historical knowledge or the time to dive into these matters to truly understand that if you see a problem with election law, with the procedures manual, whatever it happens to be, it can be something as simple as technology is allowing elections department to do something that Arizona election law frankly doesn't even address, like ballot images. There is nothing in law in the state of Arizona regarding ballot images. The only thing that directs the county elections department to deal with ballot images was a lawsuit. Things as simple and straightforward as the image of a ballot, it would be nice if it was actually discussed and debated and the legislature gets behind and then the governor signs off on it, it's actual law, rather than relying on various court hearings, and then whoever puts together procedures manual has to interpret all of these different legal things at the federal level, at the state level, apply Arizona state law, figure out how the procedures come about, put it all together, and then figure out the new stuff that's come along that's going to further complicate things. A commission that has some people that have some experience, some knowledge, bipartisan, that can sit down and look at Arizona election law top to bottom, look at the procedures manual, apply what the federal government, be it the legislature or various federal courts, how conduct of elections is supposed to take place, kind of makes sense. And the longer I've had conversations with people, the more I've come to the conclusion that for some of these things to truly take place, and Barbara, one of your pet peeves is Arizona election law keeps talking about mechanical voting. Well, nobody does that anymore. Those are the kinds of things that a commission can probably sit down, address, and then actually bring Arizona election law into the 21st century. Again, the conversations I've had with both members of this commission kind of like the idea, and I put it before this commission. I propose that we ask the Board of Supervisors to put their weight behind it, to the governor, to the new Secretary of State, and to the members of the legislature. Let's actually sit down and do something as a state that maybe gets rid of part of that black eye of Arizona election law. We still haven't decided the Senate race in the state of Arizona a week and a half after elections, or whatever it happens to be.
Well, the way Title 16 is written now, you could almost argue that counting ballot images is illegal.
That's a good point, but it's not really to Bill's point.
No, it's not, but the point is, that is something that needs to be addressed, because the entire election law and the procedures manual are so far out of date as to be ridiculous. I mean, I don't know if it's ever been changed, but I brought this up to Steve Farley when he was still in the legislature. The petitions for Superior Court judges have to be for the term ending 19 blank.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing, Benny White did a thorough analysis of the election law maybe 4 or 5 years ago, put a list of all the things that were either outdated or inconsistent.
Yeah. And the legislature keeps putting Band-Aids that interfere with each other.
And I asked him if he still had this, and he said no, he was so discouraged.
I'm sure, Barbie, you probably have your list of pet peeves over the years. I know I've got my pet peeve list. Previous members of this commission, conversations I've had with them over the years, they've got their list. And I have not seen enough action out of the legislature in the past dozen or more years to give me any confidence that the kinds of things that keep getting proposed, even if they make it out of both chambers and to the governor's desk, are really going to do anything to truly get us where we need to be from an election integrity standpoint in the state of Arizona. My genuine fear is if some of this stuff isn't truly brought up to date and brought into conformity between 15 different counties, we're going to have an election that's going to make national headlines, and it's not going to be a good thing.
Would you like to make a resolution that we write a letter to the Board of Supervisors?
That's what I proposed.
Okay, we'll make that
Second.
formally.
Second.
Any discussion?
That was a motion by Bill Beard and seconded by Chris Cole.
Yep.
All right, now there's all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, maybe.
Brian, you for it?
Brian, are you still there?
There's the Brian.
Oh, I'm still here, I just had to take the phone off mute.
Yeah.
I'm for it.
Thank you.
Okay, so,
And Brad, I'll come by and talk to you about the mechanism to make this happen.
okay,
Okay,
very good. And assume that the letter is okay as is, but if there are typos or something like that, it'll be fixed.
Yeah. The only change that probably should be made is, instead of it being Bill Beard, it should be Brian as chair.
Right,
That's fine.
right. Okay, the motion has succeeded.
Thank you all.
All right, moving on to the Secretary of State invitation. Brian, that's you again?
You should have received a copy of a draft memo to the Secretary of State inviting her to participate in her meeting. We will accommodate her to the extent that we can. One thing I'd like to point out goes down to agenda item, whatever future meeting dates is concerned. If our April meeting falls on the traditional date, which is the third Friday, that happens to be Holy Week for those people that are concerned about issues like that. So I would recommend meeting at a date other than Good Friday.
We'll have to discuss this later. Yeah, we'll have to put that at the end of the agenda, but the letter as such,
The only addition I would have is please bring whoever your new elections director is with you.
good point.
may I respond to that?
Yes.
a little bit? It is my understanding that Secretary Hobbs has appointed a lady by the name of Bo, B-O, last name Dole, D as in David, U-L. She is an attorney and a member of the State Bar of Arizona, but that's about all I know.
That's the new elections director?
That is the new elections director. Her true name, first name, is actually Sambo, first word, just like you would expect it to be spelled, but she goes by Bo. She is apparently of Cambodian descent, if you're wondering what kind of name that might be, and very proud of it, I would say.
Okay.
No problem with me?
I have a little problem with your list of items, included but not limited to. There's pretty specific. Maybe we could make them more general.
I don't have any problem making them more general or expanding the list. I kind of made it specific because those are things that came to mind from my perspective and I'd like to see addressed, but I can certainly make the memo more general than it is, no problem at all.
And I think part of the reason for meeting with her is to know what her priorities are and where she's headed, that sort of thing too.
And we can encompass that in the memo as well.
Okay, don't I have a motion to send a memo to the Secretary of State?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passed unanimously. I assume you voted yes, Brian?
I did.
So this memo will go out in some form that Brian will complete and send the memo. Okay.
Brad, are you going to be in the office next Wednesday?
I'm sorry, Brian, this is Brad, did you direct the question to me?
Yes, sir. Are you going to be in the office next Wednesday?
No, my wife and I are gonna be celebrating a life event in Las Vegas next week.
Wow.
Craps.
You're,
Leave your credit cards.
you won or lost?
So I'm assuming you're going to be out of the office, if not all of next week, certainly the tail end of it.
All of next week. But back in the office on the 28th.
Okay, if you could block some time on the 28th for me, I'll come by and visit with you about these issues, and we'll get them taken care of as expeditiously as possible, but just shoot me an email and let me know what time works for you, and I'll adjust my schedule.
Will do, thank you.
All right, next item, recorder's office invitation. Arnie is not here. Brian, did you want to say something, or shall we just go put this the next time?
Well, it's a memo again, and I can make it more general or more specific, but it's trying to get some input from the recorder's office and rebuild the relationship we've had there. On a personal basis, I think I have a fairly good relationship with that man. I think the important thing to understand, and I've had kind of some peripheral conversations with Supervisor Valadez about this, our ability to demand or expect anything from the recorder's office is limited, as is the Board of Supervisors. It is an independent entity. She is an elected official, just like the supervisors are, and they have limited control over her or direction on our part regarding the recorder's office outside establishing her budget, and they're even restricted in that regard. So I think it's a matter of trying to get some information that would be beneficial to us as well as her, but I think trying to delve into her business is something that we need to be very careful about.
I think that's a tactfully written memo there.
The only thing I might include is your deputy director, Chris Rhodes, as well. I mean, if she wants to send Chris instead of her coming.
Yeah, it says, or you or your representative.
Oh, sorry.
Sure, not a problem.
Yeah, I know she likes to be approached directly rather than us to contact Chris.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I also know from a previous experience that she wants to be a little more specific about what we would like to discuss. Without having three
And
pages.
those are discussions that I'll have with somebody. I'll try and come up with a much more specific list, but I want the list to be specific as far as items that have to bear on the elections department as opposed to voter registration, which is a recorder function. And as much as we like to think that it impacts elections, it's something that we have no purview over.
Okay, so I have a motion to approve some kind of a letter to the recorder, trying to get them more involved in what we're doing.
So moved.
Second?
Second. Yeah, we gotta stop monopolizing.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So Brian, it's up to you to take the initiative here. I also have a good relationship with that man. Maybe the two of us could meet with her at some time.
Okay,
You work out the
I'll be in
details?
touch when I get back in town.
Okay, you work out the details.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Pima County hand count audit. I don't know why that's on here. Okay.
Well, this is some, looking at this is something that Tom Ryan sent out to everybody.
Oh, right, okay. You want to bring up any particular points or things you want to talk about?
Why did Tom leave the commission? If he's gonna be
If memory serves, it's because he was traveling so much and was going to be spending more time traveling that made it
Okay.
difficult to remain on the commission.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah.
When you retire, you can do that,
Yeah. Gee.
supposedly.
Supposedly, yeah. It's just, though, you know,
I did send a response to that memo with a couple of specific things where I think you didn't have full information. Did you all get that?
no,
It's in your copy. It should be.
it's in the copy here?
Yeah, it should be one of the first parts because it's an email, so it'll be at the top of the first page.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
there we go, yeah.
All right, now I understand. Okay. Yeah, well, my biggest thing is everything he's recommending sounds good, but I'm not sure that mechanically, so to speak, they are worth the effort. You know, it's like for example, he's suggesting, I think, if I understand what he's saying here, at item 1, that the procedure for selecting the 34 batches to be selected from, you know, that the selection process somehow be saved.
And it is. This was part of my reply was that it is safe.
Two things. One, and this relates partly back to conversations about the proposed legislative changes. One, and it directly relates to something that you mentioned, Barbara, in your response about not all 15 counties follow the same procedures. And in my conversations with members of the legislature, one of the things that the Maricopa issue, not directly, but the lawsuit that came about forcing the counties to have the same cure procedures for those early ballots. That lawsuit brought about, it's not uniform, but brought about some recognition amongst the members of the legislature that the 15 counties don't do things the same across the board. And whether it's in the procedures manual or they're, you know, just because of years, that's the way they've always done it, that's the way they're going to continue to do it in some of the smaller counties. The recognition that these different procedures can have a direct impact on some of these races, be they the statewide races or where you have overlapping jurisdictions outside of county lines. And whether or not that brings about some legislative changes, I think looking at this hand count audit letter from Tom, taking a step back and beyond just what the hand count audit specifics are, but to the point you brought up and some of the issues that this memo brings up, I think it is important to take a look at some of those broader things because it goes to the general idea of election integrity. If you've got one county handling provisional ballots one way and another county doing it slightly different, or the conditional provisional, or the early ballots, or whatever it happens to be, that will have a direct impact if the race is close enough. I don't care what side you're on.
Remind you, the agenda item is a hand count.
I was taking both dealing with it and a step back at the same time.
Yeah.
So,
Madam Chair,
Yes, Brian?
going to Bill's comment about the fact that there's little uniformity among the 15 counties, I think the more relevant issue, not that that's not relevant, is the fact that less than 50% of the counties actually participate in any kind of a hand count audit.
Right. And perhaps the legislation at some point should address this in terms of if they don't do the hand count audit, they should do some other kind of an audit. But that's not actually in the legislature. at this
Either
point.
that or eliminate the requirement that the two major parties be participant or are the driving force behind an in-count audit, which is my understanding now, is there's a lack of interest on the part of Republicans, Democrats, or both in a number of counties to get people sufficient to do a hand count audit.
This is an area where I think Bill's Bi-Partisan Commission could well address the topic.
Yep.
Sure.
Any more?
If they don't wanna do it, it's no requirement by law, well, they're not gonna
So
do
is
it.
this something we want to, just for point of clarification, going back to earlier discussions, is this something we want to propose that we need to do as a proactive thing, or do we wait for the legislature to pump it out in a bill somewhere?
What do you mean? Be more specific, what would you propose?
What you're talking about right now, the way the hand counts are handled variously, various.
That's not really our jurisdiction, the other.
For Pima County's purposes, I think we kind of do what we're supposed to do and go above and beyond for the most part. It does go to a broader issue, you know, yeah, Pima County election integrity can be affected by what Coconino County does or doesn't do for a candidate
That's-
X, Y, or Z, but it's less of a Pima County centric issue.
Right, so maybe we, and a lot of this will be dealt with when the procedures manual
Oh,
comes out in draft form at some point.
How many versions have you worked on?
but this is something that the commission may not be able to do anything about officially, but the individuals can. You know, so, you know, it got brought to our attention, and it's something that needs to be handled.
Right. All right, any further discussion? The 2018 annual report. Brian?
I'm assuming everybody has a copy of it. Again, like I said earlier during my comments at the beginning, that if you have any recommendations, comments, suggestions, corrections, please email them to me. I would like to get it to the board of supervisors as soon after the February meeting as possible. So I'm certainly open to any input that anybody wants to provide.
Thank you for doing all this, it's a big effort. Anybody have any particular comments on what he's done here? So let's give people a week to email you any more comments and then finalize it.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Do we need a motion to the effect of submitting it?
It sounds like he's going to, we'll be voting on it at the February meeting. Was I incorrect on that, Brian?
You're correct. We voted on it at the February meeting.
Okay, very good.
Hence the title February.
Very good. All
Okay.
right.
Pinky
Andrew, question. 12, elections flow chart.
Or the card. So even though the election was in early November, it actually ended for us last Friday. And I don't mean by counting votes or declaring who the winner is, but the Elections Assistance Commission at the U.S. federal level wishes a report on polling place training, polling place accessibility, voter outreach, how many provisionals were cast, how many were rejected, what have you like that. That report just finished last Friday, so we do not have a flow chart to show yet. I'm guessing that we'll probably have it, I don't think we're going to go this late, but we'll probably have it by April, if not March, if not February. Mary and David are working on that right now, and they're not working from scratch. They're working from the about 35-page flow chart that we had previously. That
Some
needs to
flow
be
charts
updated.
are just a picture in one page.
You know, we could do one of those. I could do one of those right now if you really wanted to. But what we're doing, to repeat myself from a previous meeting, is that the last time the flow chart was done, we still had scanners at the polling places. Those scanners had to be brought back physically to be able to upload into the server. We did not have the number of permanent early voting that we do have now, so we're tweaking it a little bit to talk about what our current situation is. But it probably will be available for the February meeting, but I'm not going to make any promises that soon.
Could there be just a short abridged version?
Well, because we're taking it down from 35 pages to 24 pages, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, we had the recorder on there as well. We had the U.S. Postal Service on there as well. And so we had everything on there. But when I say we, John Moffett was the one who actually got that flow chart together. So he went out to every particular little branch and twig you could think of off of that tree and made that flow chart. I don't have the resources that Mr. Moffett did, nor the time, to do into that detail. So I will give you what the elections department does, not what other entities do.
Can you provide the old starting point?
Sure, I can do that today.
When we do it all?
Okay.
I think, regardless, I think the flow chart will be a valuable tool.
Yeah. Hopefully that will clarify in our minds a lot of things that we didn't know weren't clarified.
Yeah.
Probably raise some more.
You're catching on!
I'd like to stick in here one item, one of the last items, toward the end of your flow chart ought to be reporting on the website what the election results were.
Okay, I think that,
Yeah, and I'd like to just compliment David for really doing a good job this time. I had some discussion with him on how non-user friendly his previous versions were. I think it's really good this time.
David is an analytic, and if you think on his way, it works, but you have to think on a person on the street level.
Yeah, this one's really good. I looked at the form of reports for all the other counties, and there were two that were probably better, or at least as good as Pima County, and everything else was pretty bad. And some of them were just PDFs. That's a compliment. All right. Steve isn't here to talk about calling into meetings, so I don't think we have anything to discuss there. Future agenda items?
So are we, put that on the next agenda?
Yeah, we can do that.
Forward that. There are some things, it's hard, as Brian is, I'm sure, finding now. It's hard to be on the other end of that phone, not know who's talking, not be able to hear it all clearly, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
Okay. Put that on the next
maybe we
agenda.
could go towards a visual kind of a version in the future.
Do we have the technology to do something like Skype?
I think you'd have to go to a different room to do so.
Yeah, I don't think the N4 ones would handle what would need to be done. We could try and set it up.
Where did we do Dr. Stark's Skype?
Here?
This might be an
Yeah.
issue.
I think it was on the fourth floor, though. Might have been.
Okay.
Also, I don't think that the.
No, it was this one.
It was this room.
Is this room? I remember that, you're right, you did, it was right here.
Yeah.
Close the blinds down and
Yep.
plug it in, and there it went.
Seems to me we had some problems, but I think we
I
solved them.
remember the problem.
I think it was the on his end, getting things to advance or something. So.
Right.
Something happened.
The other issue would be trying to do the video recording and make it work with the Skype via.
Well, you can do it.
I will see what I can come up with. No promises.
Okay.
Does it hurt that there would be even two versions of what's on the Skype and what's on that? I mean, how does that?
That is our recorded minutes. We don't do written minutes, it's all video. So it has to be able to appear on the video.
Sure.
And I have no idea how to merge multiple video feeds into a single coherent.
Could you do that as a link?
I don't know. I don't.
We'll figure,
I'm not-
we'll explore it.
We'll effort it.
All right.
You'll have to talk to IT.
Then everybody could just stay home and, you know, they didn't have to schedule a board meeting.
Oh, okay.
That's what we're getting to with elections. I don't know.
Bite your tongue.
Okay, future agenda items, we have calling into meetings, we have the annual report, Secretary of State invitation, status of that, commission, anything we learned about that, legislative, so anything else?
I'd like for us to be able to talk about our name next time, just have a conversation. I think our name is misleading, giving the preponderance of votes that come in through the mail system, through the recorder. And part of being an integrity commission is to be what we are. We have, as we've discussed, very little control and no authority, nor does the board of supervisors or the recorder.
So
I
what
don't
would
know
you
what-
change it to?
I don't know.
That's discussion.
That's the discussion.
Okay, so that's another future agenda item. Any others? What, is there any movement on updating our computer system?
Oh, you mean the tabulation
Yeah,
system?
tabulation system?
Yeah, there was supposed to be a new software version this year.
So, here's what I know.
It's not on the agenda.
It's not on the agenda.
Okay.
Yeah, but is this something worth putting on the agenda for next time?
Yes, it may be still no further information, but it is possible.
Okay.
Yeah, we should have some knowledge about, at least knowledge about the updates.
I realize it's a future agenda item, but just as a preface for our further discussion in the next meeting, we have a brand new Secretary of State who may change the certification processes, the certification board that certifies equipment.
That's
So
Brian's
how-
board.
Yeah, how soon that might occur, I don't know. I believe they are doing, some various vendors are doing some demonstrations before the Secretary of State's office this month. But whether those are just additional demonstrations or actually certification demonstrations, I don't know. But there is one coming, I just don't know the timing. But I'll try and get more information.
And hopefully we'll welcome the board. Commissioner.
Any other future agenda items? Next meeting date, February 15th, any problem with that?
I'm actually going to, I know I'm not a voting member, but I'm going to suggest a topic on the next agenda if I may.
Yeah.
And that is our HALA accessible voting equipment for future elections. We're proposing a change.
Oh, okay, good.
That's expensive stuff.
Yes, it is. It's more expensive to go to the court.
I understand.
Okay, that's all for future agenda items. Looks like a big agenda. And if by any chance the Secretary of State should come to that meeting, we would probably have that be most of the agenda and table most of the other items to another date. February 15th, okay, that's next week.
Yep.
Ryan, February 15th?
February 15th, March 15th, they're both fine. I would recommend moving the April 19th meeting to April the 12th, if that doesn't cause a problem for anybody else.
Okay, we'll consider that the next meeting around. All right.
Will we adjourn?
Motion for adjournment? All in favor?
Aye.